Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jude Blanchette. I'm the Freeman Chair in China Studies at CSIS. I'm really delighted to welcome a virtual audience to this important discussion of public opinion in Taiwan with a focus on United States, U.S.-China relations, and cross-strait relations. Obviously, Taiwan is becoming an increasing focus in debates and discussions here in the United States, as well as capitals around the world. There's a growing recognition of Taiwan's importance, both for global supply chains, but also for the defense picture in the Indo-Pacific, especially for the United States. And we've seen a growing number of threats to Taiwan emanate from Beijing over the last decade or so. Just this year, we saw the military exercises by the People's Liberation Army in the wake of President William Lai's inauguration on May 20th. Just after that, we saw a new document issued by the PRC Supreme Court threatening to try in absentia, quote unquote, diehard independence diehards and potentially give them the death penalty. So this is just raising concern in the United States and elsewhere about Taiwan and its and the continuing peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. Unfortunately, missing from a lot of these discussions on Taiwan are what the people on Taiwan actually think. And so to help rectify that, I'm really delighted to welcome for this important discussion four great guests who can give us a unique vantage point and set of insights based on recent survey data on important questions about how people in Taiwan are looking at China, are looking at the United States, are processing comments made here as we're in an election year in the United States by candidates for president. And this is a really critical missing piece, I think, of the discussion. So in no particular order, but all wonderful guests, I'm delighted to welcome James Lee, who's an assistant research fellow in the Institute of European and American Studies at Academia Sinica, Xin Pan, who's an associate professor of sociology at Soochow University in Taiwan, Wenqin Wu, a research fellow in the Institute of Political Science at Academia Sinica, and finally, Jianhui Wu, who's a research fellow at the Institute of European and American Studies at Academia Sinica. I'm not going to give much by way of context of the survey data because I'm going to allow our guests to run through that. But just in terms of format for today, we only now have about 55 minutes left. I'm going to turn the virtual podium over to our guests as they are going to share their screen and walk through some really fascinating new survey results that cover some of these critically important questions of how does the Taiwan public view the United States and China. We're then going to try to save 15 or 20 minutes, hopefully, for Q&A. And I will say, if you go to the CSIS website, click on the event page for this event, you will see a button where you can submit a question. Those will be fed to me, and I will work those into the discussion. We've already gotten questions come in, which is great. We believe in mass democracy here at CSIS, so welcome the active participation of viewers. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to James, who's going to help kick us off. James, over to you.
Great. Thank you all so much for coming. And thank you to Jude and the rest of the team at CSIS for their support in hosting this event. So as Jude mentioned, our research is focusing on how the Taiwanese public views the United States and China. And this survey is called the American Portrait Survey, and it's a survey that we fielded annually since 2021 on the state of U.S.-Taiwan-China relations. It's sponsored by the Institute of European and American Studies at Academia Sinica and administered by the Election Studies Center at National Chengchi University in Taiwan. So it's designed and implemented by two leading Taiwanese academic institutions which have years and even decades of experience carrying out public opinion research in Taiwan. And the broad themes that the survey addresses are the credibility of the United States and how that's changed over time, the threat from China, and how respondents in Taiwan interpret U.S. and Chinese signals, the U.S. commitment and the Chinese threat to Taiwan. So to provide a little more information about our sample, it was administered in the first 2 weeks after Li's inauguration, the 23rd of May to the 28th of May. And it partly coincides with the period of the PRC military exercises because Beijing held exercises near Taiwan from the 23rd to the 24th of May. And our sample size is 1,236. And our survey method was a phone interview, a computer-assisted phone interview with roughly even distribution of landline and mobile telephones, 58% for landline and 42% for mobile interviews. And the respondents in our survey are adults of voting age at 20 and above because the voting age in Taiwan is 20. So it's a broadly representative survey of the Taiwanese electorate. And so that's an overview of our sample. And now I'll turn it over to my colleague, Xin Pan, to discuss the U.S. skepticism narrative.
Please turn the slide to the U.S. skepticism narrative. This U.S. skepticism narrative is a signature question in our American Portrait Survey. As of June 2024, President Biden has made arms sales to Taiwan for 15 times and publicly reiterated U.S. security commitment to Taiwan for 5 times. Given all the strong signals, that unprecedented signals, a substantial portion of people in Taiwan still twists and turns over flying color U.S. skepticism. Here, credibility means living up to one's words in the original language. In other words, the consistency between words and deeds is what we mean by credibility. Many long-term factors sow the seed of U.S. skepticism in Taiwan for those all-time believers of or otherwise. For instance, Taiwan's conservatism makes Taiwan marginalized for international politics to seek out alliances other than the United States. Taiwan's power parity to China casts doubts on fending off China on its own. Disinformation from China paints the U.S. unreliable and weak ally. Taiwan's reliance on the U.S. for its security leads to over-interpretation of U.S. signals. U.S. strategic ambiguity for the last four decades further divides people in Taiwan to selectively expose themselves to the information pieces they want from the U.S. government. Lastly, the ongoing war in Ukraine makes a referential point for people in Taiwan to see what the U.S. would have treated an informal ally in crisis. Next slide, please. U.S. credit. So in this slide, we show the U.S. credibility, the trend for the last 4 years. To evaluate the scope of U.S. skepticism in Taiwan, we present respondents a question about U.S. credibility for the last 4 waves of survey since 2021. In 2021, Taiwanese was evenly divided on U.S. credibility. Next year, in the face of China threat of attack on Pelosi's plane, she visited Taiwan anyway, as she previously committed to. She did not cringe back. So this raised a majority of respondents to assign credibility to the U.S. Then the trend persisted until 2023, when President Biden repeatedly talked about the U.S. credibility, U.S. security commitment to Taiwan during the presidential election. This year, Taiwanese have some concerns for the turbulent U.S. presidential election. The trend is generally stable over time, with some ups and downs, showing sensitivity to short-term events. Next slide, we also present a question about Chinese credibility to compare with that of U.S. credibility. We can see from this chart, an overwhelming percentage of people in Taiwan do not believe that China is credible. Such trend is very consistent and stable for the last 4 years. Only about 10% of Taiwanese believe that China is credible. This will cast a huge shadow for any Taiwanese government to work with the Chinese government. And this has largely owing to what Chinese government's brutal suppression on Hong Kong. Next slide, please. So if we should break down the U.S. credibility by partisanship, we see that the pan-blue camp, including KMT and TPP, are the base for U.S. skepticism. They are the pan-blue supporters, mostly the recipient of information from China, whereas the supporters of TPP, the ruling party, is all for the U.S. credibility. So U.S. credibility is essentially politically charged by the DPP supporters. Next slide, please. So if we should further break down the Chinese credibility by partisanship as well, we see KMT supporters show strong ups and downs on the Chinese credibility. Having said that, it remains a major base for the Chinese credibility. DPP supporters embrace strong doubts toward China, and that the trend is very consistent for DPP supporters. So we can see that KMT supporters still not all for the Chinese credibility, despite that it is the major source of Chinese credibility in Taiwan. Then we switch forward to James Lee.
Okay, great.
Next slide. If we should put the U.S. and Chinese credibility by partisanship on the same map, we know that Taiwanese are divided when TPP is pro-U.S. and KMT is pro-China regarding the credibility. Also, the U.S. credibility is not at the toe of the Chinese credibility and vice versa. So the credibility assigned to the two countries are independently evaluated. And then next, James Lee will introduce the likelihood of U.S. defending Taiwan.
So in our survey, we also asked respondents what they think about the potential impact of a Trump presidency, a second Trump administration, and it's a topic that is very much on people's minds these days, both in the U.S. and in Taiwan. And so the top line here in this chart is for the total pool of respondents. And so what we see is like the dark orange refers to respondents who think that Trump winning a second term would definitely decrease the U.S. willingness to defend Taiwan. And then the lighter shade of orange is for respondents who think that Trump having a second term would somewhat decrease the U.S. willingness to defend Taiwan. And then the blue figures are for respondents who think that a Trump second term would somewhat increase, or for dark blue, definitely increase the U.S. willingness to defend Taiwan. And so what we see is that there's a roughly even distribution, somewhat more in the direction of respondents thinking that a second Trump administration would have a decrease on the U.S. willingness to defend Taiwan, but it's not a very strong trend. So there are a lot of mixed views in Taiwan. But I think what this shows, if you look at the brown part of the chart that refers to respondents who said that it would stay about the same, is that that's actually a very low proportion of the total sample. So what we find is that people think that Trump having a second term would have an impact on the U.S. willingness to defend Taiwan, but they don't have a consensus on whether it would decrease or increase the U.S. commitment to Taiwan. And in the other parts of this chart, we break it down by partisanship, and we ask what do DPP supporters think, what do KMT supporters think, and what do TPP, which is a smaller opposition party, what do their supporters think. And so what we find is that KMT and TPP supporters, the opposition parties, they're more likely than supporters of the ruling party, the DPP, to think that Trump would have a negative impact on the U.S. willingness to defend Taiwan. There's a very conspicuous difference in terms of KMT and TPP supporters, the opposition, and the current ruling party. Next slide, please. And we also break down this data based on national identity. And what we find is that respondents who hold Chinese identity, either exclusively or both Chinese and Taiwanese identity, are much more likely to have a negative assessment of the impact of a Trump presidency on the U.S. willingness to defend Taiwan. And on the other hand, respondents who identify as purely Taiwanese are less likely to think that a Trump presidency would have a negative impact on the U.S. willingness to defend Taiwan. So overall, what we find is that perceptions of Trump's impact on U.S. foreign policy are influenced pretty strongly by partisanship and national identity. Next slide, please. And we also ask respondents what they think about the nature of the status quo. The term status quo is a highly contested term between the United States and China. Both sides are trying to portray the other as being being the revisionist power and trying to portray themselves as being the status quo power. And there's been a global competition for control of this narrative about which side exactly is being status quo and which side is being revisionist. And so that's between the US and China. We turn to a key part of this issue, which is what do the Taiwanese themselves think? And once again, we break it down by partisanship and national identity. And the top bar refers to the total, previous slide, please. So the top bar refers to the total poll of respondents. And what we find is that, so the green part of the bar refers to respondents who say that Taiwan and China do not belong to the same country. And that represents over 80% of our sample. So over 80% of respondents think that Taiwan and China do not belong to the same country. And as you might intuitively expect, that proportion is much higher for DPP supporters. 97.4% of DPP supporters don't think Taiwan and China are part of the same country. But what's also really interesting is that even for KMT supporters, over 50% of KMT supporters don't think Taiwan and China are part of the same country. And that's a result that is consistent with previous waves of our survey. And it's quite striking and in some ways surprising because the KMT's official platform for cross-strait policy is that Taiwan and China are part of the same country. They just disagree on what the name of that country is. And yet we find that the KMT's supporters among the Taiwanese electorate actually don't hold to that particular view. And potentially this could raise questions about the viability of what the so-called 1992 consensus over the long term. But there is a reason to doubt that this platform on cross-strait relations and this platform on sovereignty espoused by the KMT officially as a party is one that is broadly popular among the KMT support base. Next slide, please. And we also disaggregate this data based on national identity. And what we find is that respondents who identify as purely Taiwanese are much more likely to think that Taiwan and China do not belong to the same country. And respondents who identify as both Chinese and Taiwanese also have this kind of interesting finding that over 50% don't think Taiwan and China are part of the same country. The only part of our sample where the respondents do think a majority of respondents think Taiwan and China are part of the same country is for the respondents who identify as purely Chinese, but they only represent 2.3% of the overall sample. And overall, regardless of whether you break it down by national identity or by partisanship, the majority view in Taiwan is that Taiwan is not part of China. Next slide, please. So to conclude, our overall findings, these are kind of takeaways from our survey. The Taiwanese perceptions of U.S. credibility have increased substantially between 2023 and 2024. So after 2021, there was this drop in the perceptions of U.S. credibility, and then it remained relatively stable. And in the past year, perceptions of U.S. credibility have increased significantly. A clear majority of Taiwanese interpret the status quo to mean that Taiwan and China are not part of the same country. And this is true even among KMT supporters and among respondents who identify as both Chinese and Taiwanese. And with regard to the impact of a second Trump administration, there are mixed views about which direction the overall trend lines in U.S. support for Taiwan will go, but people do have views, and very few people think that U.S. policy will maintain a broad continuity with U.S. policy under the Biden administration. So those are our overall findings for this survey. We're very happy to take questions in the Q&A, in which we'll be able to explain more of our findings in more detail, but you're also very welcome to consult our project website if you're interested in these results. We have a dedicated website. The URL is listed here, and if you Google American Portrait Taiwan, it should come up pretty quickly on Google. But now we'll turn it over to Jude for the Q&A, and look forward to answering your questions.
Great, James, Xin, that was fantastic, and I want to apologize. I see that some of the myself as well as some of the viewers on the live stream had challenges seeing some of the first few slides. So apologize for that. But as James said, you can go to AmericanPortrait.tw to learn more about this. I wonder if I could just ask a few follow-up questions on the survey itself. And Xin, I might start with you just to make sure I'm completely clear on what the word credibility means. Can you walk me through again exactly what you mean in this context of U.S. and China credibility increasing?
So the definition, we use the word 讲信用 in the original language in our survey question. So our respondents understand the term credibility in the way that the country lives up to its words. Like it will live up to the words that it says. So there is a consistency between words and deeds between the two countries. For example, China's unilateral breach of its signing UK treaties on Hong Kong, that is a classic case that diminished the Chinese credibility in its Chinese credibility. So, but for the United States, oftentimes its security commitment is hinged on its long-term strategic ambiguity policies. So it remains ambiguous for people in Taiwan to understand to understand whether the United States will or will not fulfill its commitment. That's why U.S. credibility is of greater vagueness and ambiguity in Taiwan.
On the just staying on this for a minute, Xin. So I understand that, but in the case of China, for example, is it that, let's take a statement that ostensibly China is seeking peaceful reunification. Is that seen as a credible statement? Is that what we mean by credibility? I understand broadly the concept, but when it comes to fulfilling what their promises are, again, you could look at just the words of how China is saying it would like to resolve cross-strait issues peacefully. But I think many of us analysts watching this don't necessarily find that as a fully credible statement. So can you just help me understand how where specifically the credibility that is being assessed is pertaining? Which statements or promises by China are the ones that you're assessing?
We in our survey questions, we do not specifically target which dimension of credibility that for either the United States or China. So we evaluate in a general sense. So it could involve with commercially or politically or diplomatically on many fronts of the international commitments the United States, either the United States or China, could possibly commit to Taiwan.
And then on the U.S. side, do you have a sense of what are the concrete actions or statements that shift Taiwan views on U.S. credibility? Is it President Biden saying repeatedly that the United States would defend Taiwan? Is it actions by Congress? Is it arms sales? Do you have any sense of what moves the needle on U.S. credibility?
We have a slide on the U.S. signals on this regard. So let me switch the floor to Wenqin Wu to present the slides and explain that. Wenqin, please. Page 20.
Yeah, thank you. So I think
we might just need a minute technically
sure.
to get the slides up, and I want to make sure we have them up this time. That way.
It's in page 19 for the slides. So okay. Actually, we know that in the past few years, the United States has adopted a serious policy to show a signal of helping Taiwan. So in our survey, actually, we asked questions. Sorry, it's about page 19, not 20, the previous page. Yeah. So we asked a series of policies like the presidential commitment to defend Taiwan, or the arms sales to Taiwan, or the air and naval patrol around the Taiwan Strait, or the international participation of Taiwan. So we asked our respondent in our survey whether those specific policies will increase their perception of the U.S. likelihood of defending Taiwan. And it turns out that on average, I mean, as we can see that for the top, on the top of this panel, actually the air patrol or air and naval patrol will be a strong signal of the U.S. Resolve or U.S. willingness to defend Taiwan. On the other hand, we can also see that presidential commitment or arms sale also have a very strong effect of sending signal of U.S. Willingness to defend Taiwan. And if we disaggregate our respondent by their partisanship, we can also see that for the DPP supporters, they can perceive those signals as a strong commitment of the U.S. to defend Taiwan under strategic ambiguity. However, for those KMT supporters, for a series of U.S. policy toward Taiwan, they tend to less believe in that the U.S. policy can show the signal to defend Taiwan. So that would be how the U.S. policies send a signal of defending Taiwan to Taiwanese citizens. Yeah, so I think that will also affect the so-called U.S. credibility in the eyes of the Taiwanese public. Yeah, thank you very much.
Wen-Chin, sorry. Jianhui,
do we have other Chinese threat slides? I guess so.
Yeah,
Maybe
that's on the page 20, the next one. So this is a new set of questions we asked in our latest wave of survey. So we asked about Taiwanese evaluation of China's threat against Taiwan. So we asked whether those series of policies of China against Taiwan on different issues, no, I mean, this is an overall statement. So for this study, is the overall evaluation of China's threat on Taiwan. So again, we can see that almost 60% of respondents think that China's threat against Taiwan increased in the past few years. And we can also see that for DPP supporters, they tend to believe that China's threat increased a lot. However, we can see that for the KMT or for those non-partisans, they have fewer proportion of members to believe that China's threat against Taiwan increased in the past few years. So that's the overall assessment of China's threat. But in our survey, we also asked about China's different policies, but it's on our technical report, so you are welcome to refer to our technical report. So we also evaluate how China's policy, just like the Xi Jinping statement regarding unifying Taiwan, or whether China's military exercise has posed some threat against Taiwan. So again, there are some partisan differences, but yeah, you're welcome to refer to our report on our website. Thank you very much.
Wen-Chin, if I may ask a follow-up question on the threat issue, it's the flip side of a different question I was going to ask on the credibility or the question about the U.S. willingness to defend. Have you specified the Chinese threat of what? And the flip side is the U.S. defense of Taiwan in what scenario? Are we explicitly or implicitly talking about an invasion in both scenarios? Or is the definition of the China threat as respondents are answering it more comprehensive, right? It could be about the threat of economic coercion, political infiltration, and conversely, is this about the U.S. defending Taiwan in scenarios short of military attack? Do you have any sense of that?
Yeah, of course, we have different scenarios for possible China attack on Taiwan or China's threat against Taiwan, and also possible scenarios for U.S. defense for Taiwan. In our survey, actually, we focus on two parts. The first part is whether China will use military force to attack Taiwan. So we ask our respondent to evaluate the likelihood of China to attack Taiwan with military force. And again, we ask them to evaluate if China adopt a certain policy. For example, Xi Jinping says that the China will never give up using force against Taiwan. And for a statement like this, will it increase the likelihood of China to use military force to attack Taiwan? So that's part of our survey. So in that case, actually, more than 60% of respondents think that that will increase their perception of China's likelihood of using military force to against Taiwan. So that's for one part. And on the other hand, we also focus on whether the United States will use military force to defend Taiwan. So in our survey, we specifically focus on U.S. defense for Taiwan with military force. It's not just military on sale or other part of assistance. It's a military force, or military assistance. So that's the two part we are going to evaluate in our survey.
If I may bring in some of the audience questions now, Xin, I might ask this to you, but Wen-Chin, I would be curious your thoughts as well, because this connects to the credibility of U.S. signal slide. There's a question, Xin, about unpacking the U.S. skepticism narrative a little bit more, the Yimeilun. This is a simple question, or I'm going to ask a question simply. Does that mean if we connect the American skepticism narrative, if we connect that to what Wen-Chin just talked about in terms of credibility of U.S. signals, does that mean that if the United States does more air and naval patrols, which seem to be the most potent way of increasing U.S. credibility, that is the best way to attack or to mitigate the U.S. skepticism, or is that too simple of a connection to draw? In other words, what are some of the possible antidotes to the U.S. skepticism on Taiwan?
So previously, we have laid out several reasons why attributed to the rise of U.S. skepticism in Taiwan. So one of them is from China. So not only the United States could possibly send out stronger signals to enhance the Taiwanese sense of confidence in the U.S. credibility, but also we see that the China's misinformation is also a source of U.S. skepticism in Taiwan. So combating the misinformation, disinformation from China will be a major task in Taiwan to present the truth to our own people and to direct them into a better understanding of the U.S. signals. Wen-Chin, would you like to talk about the credibility of U.S. signals?
Yes, I think I already mentioned this slide before. So you can see that for air and naval patrol, we asked about the effectiveness of sending the credible signal of the United States to defend Taiwan. And we can see that in the eyes of Taiwanese public, they think air and naval patrol is the most effective way. At least more than 60% of respondents think that this kind of U.S. policy will increase their perception of the likelihood of the United States to defend Taiwan. So that's one. And the second effective policy tool is a presidential commitment. So whether the United States president will commit to defend Taiwan. And we can also see that for arms sale or arms giving, although they are effective, but fewer people believe that it's an effective tool to signal U.S. willingness to defend Taiwan. Yeah.
It's interesting how I think many of us in the United States and people in Taiwan are assessing what is credible and not. I wouldn't have thought that air and naval patrols would be the most effective credibility signal. Go, Jianhui, you want to add something?
Sorry, if I may. I think, Jude, you just mentioned, I think we try to tackle in our questionnaire is the U.S. security commitment when we talk about air and Navy patrol. In that sense, we talk mainly on U.S. security commitment in particular, instead of U.S. skepticism in general. So I see your question. There's a link, but I don't see. I guess the link between U.S. Air and Navy patrol, it enhances our belief or our credibility of Taiwan, whether U.S. would come in case of Taiwan contingency. But it may not lead to the conclusion U.S. skepticism or U.S. credibility in general. It would be largely enhanced by air and Navy control.
Great. Thanks, Jianhui. That's helpful. Turning now back to some of the questions that have been sent in, I'd like to raise a question about, and you respond to this, or you have this in the survey on Trump, but just curious for thoughts on Trump has made some comments this week in an interview on Bloomberg that again indicated at least some tentative skepticism by Trump about the security commitment to Taiwan. I know you don't have survey data for his comments this week because they happened too quickly, but curious for a subjective impression from all of you on how these comments are likely to reverberate through Taiwan.
As of now,
please.
Oh, okay. As of now, we only observe that the politicians from the blue camp and the green camp have been split up. They have shown mixed views on Trump's comments. For the ruling party, the politicians have shown like a positive attitude that what they actually welcome. They said that explicitly. They actually welcome Trump's comments like that. They would love to pay for necessary U.S. protections in exchange for at a reasonable price. So, but on the other hand, for those pan blues politicians, they have shown a very negative attitude toward Trump's comments. They believe this is a political extortion, and but as for the general public, we do not have data right now.
James, did you want to add something?
Yeah, just a couple of comments following up on Xinxin's response. So there's among the pan-blue part of the spectrum, there's been this kind of continuous narrative for several years in the kind of the U.S. skepticism framing that the U.S. Charges an unreasonably high price for the weapons it sells to Taiwan. And so Trump making these remarks about the U.S. paying Taiwan for the U.S. willingness to defend Taiwan, I think will tend to amplify these kind of U.S. skeptic narratives because it taps into an existing kind of sensitivity about arms sales in some parts of the Taiwanese political spectrum. In terms of our survey data, so earlier we presented the information showing that a U.S. presidential commitment increases the expectation of the U.S. willingness to defend Taiwan. And so while that doesn't answer your question directly, you might infer that a U.S. presidential, if you want to call it a decommitment, would have a similar effect in the opposite direction. But it's important to remember that this is only one of a range of factors. And so Trump making a certain remark could have an impact on the Taiwanese, but other U.S. policy actions could potentially offset whatever statements are coming from Trump as a candidate or Trump as potential president.
Wenxin, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but when I saw you in Taiwan, I think we were over visiting you last in September. I remember that you had some polling data that, and correct me if I'm misremembering here, which is completely possible now that I'm in middle age, but I seem to remember you had some previous data that was looking at attitudes about under Taiwan willingness to to have a more accommodative policy versus the mainland, versus China or not, in terms of attitudes of the Taiwan public about the sorts of policies they wanted to adopt. I think one of the questions here in the United States is why isn't Taiwan spending more on defense? So I know it's not in this survey data, but what are general attitudes in Taiwan about, let's say, increasing defense spending in Taiwan? Do you have any sense of how popular attitudes approach issues like preparation for a possible Chinese invasion, increasing defense spending, those types of issues?
Thank you for the question. So I think, yeah, we can answer this question from two parts. I think, according to my understanding of the many surveys, I think the general Taiwanese public, on average, support the increase of self-defense capacity. It includes the lengthening the military service from 4 months to 1 year. So we have a couple of public opinion surveys saying that it's good for the government to do so. So I think for that part, it's very obvious that Taiwanese people think that we should increase our defense capacity. For military budget, I think it's polarized. I think on average, the majority of people think that we should increase our defense capacity. But when it comes to the budget, I think some people will be more conservative because they think that the budget might need to be spent on social welfare. So it depends on how we ask the question. So if we just ask whether we support the increase of national defense budget, then people will be supportive of that kind of question. But when we frame the question that if we would like to increase the national defense budget at the expense of social welfare or other kind of budget, then people might be less willing to support. So for that part, I think that's a little bit more controversial. But to increase the military capacity, I think the general public is more supportive of that because as we can see from our survey and also other surveys, Taiwanese public think that the threat from China actually is increasing. So they would be more supportive that we should increase our defense capacity. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you. Another question that has been raised by someone in the audience is about how U.S. efforts to build its own semiconductor capacity here in the United States via things like the CHIPS Act, how those are being perceived in Taiwan. James, I'm not sure if this is for you or Jianhui, but can you just...
Maybe James would go first, then
okay.
I would add some thoughts.
So James, would you mind just responding to that question of our actions, whether that's TSMC building a fab in Arizona, but just more broadly, does that worry Taiwan that essentially the Silicon Shield is being weakened as the United States tries to onshore semiconductor capability?
So in our previous wave of the survey from last year, we asked this question about how Taiwanese perceive the relationship between TSMC and Taiwan security. And what we found was actually quite a surprising result that under 50% of respondents thought that TSMC had an impact on the U.S. commitment to Taiwan. And what we found once we disaggregated the data was that it's heavily filtered by partisanship. So DPP supporters are much more likely to believe in the statement that TSMC's importance means the U.S. is more likely to defend Taiwan, whereas KMT and TPP supporters are more likely to agree with the statement that if TSMC invests more in the U.S., it will decrease the U.S. Willingness to defend Taiwan. But overall, it's under 50%, and that was a surprising result for us. But again, it seems like there are pretty strong partisan divisions on how people interpret these kinds of developments. And I think Jianhui can say more about how the Taiwanese government is responding to these issues.
Okay, let me respond to this question in two ways. One is from a firm perspective, while the other is from state perspective. From firm's perspective, the TSMC is actually the share is largely about 80% owned by foreign investors. So it's actually a global company instead of a Taiwanese company locally. So it's a decision. One of the key decision making process is to be a reliable supplier to its clients, especially like NVIDIA or AMD. So to diversify its supply chain due to geopolitical reasons or geopolitical tensions, it is beneficial for TSMC to diversify its production bases, especially in Kumamoto. And the reason for this is quite simple, because the working culture in Japan and in Taiwan are quite similar. And this is a firm perspective, and which is a good and conducive for TSMC as a reliable supplier. And from a state perspective, we have to understand, if we go back to 90s and 80s, actually what Trump is doing now is reproducing what Donald Reagan is doing at that time. And that's when the first U.S.-Japan chip war took place in 80s and 90s. But in the end, the U.S. did not succeed in building its semiconductor industry. There are some reasons for this, especially for labor costs and other supporting measures or electricities. This is why the semiconductor industry is largely based in Taiwan. And for security reasons or for state perspective, it would ease the anxiety of its partners, its alliance, if Taiwan would diversify a bit its semiconductor to other sources, and in fact, this also contributes to the national security of Taiwan, because the supply chain would get even integrated if their ecosystem can get more integrated. And finally, the third point I want to make is what the chairman of the TSMC just mentioned. And we are moving toward a foundry 2.0, which means the traditional idea of a foundry, it enlarge the scope by incorporating assembling and packaging and testing other relevant service and supporting areas. So by this sense, or in these terms, the Taiwanese semiconductor industries, or TSMC, is not that dominant in a sense of foundry 2.0. This is basically my idea on this.
Great, thank you. Another question that came in is on how what work has been done to measure the quote will to fight in the case of if there was a direct Chinese attack on Taiwan. And again, Wenqin, I know you've done some previous work on that, but the entire group, any sense of how you have measured this question of the number of people on the island who would be willing to take up arms if China were to launch a direct attack?
Thank you, Jude. So actually, in our survey this year, we investigate this question in a great detail. So we try to use different kind of statement asking Taiwanese people's willingness to fight. So actually, there can be a couple of ways of measuring willingness to fight, whether you are willing to fight on the battlefield, whether you are going to fight for the country, or whether you are going to fight. So as we can see, actually, according to our survey result, no matter what we ask, whether it's about fight on the battlefield, fight for your country, or just fight or defend your country. So we have 4 kinds of statements. And no matter which statement we are asking, we get more than 50% of the respondents in each group saying that they are willing to support the statement. They are willing to fight. They are willing to defend the country. So I think in general, the Taiwanese public's willingness to fight in different forms are very high. So this is not just for our survey, because according to past surveys conducted by other teams, they even sometimes get about 70% of the willingness to fight. So I think in general, Taiwanese people's willingness to fight is high. Of course, we can say that there might be some social desirability issue on this matter. However, some of my colleagues in Taiwan conduct some sophisticated survey design to detect the magnitude of social desirability. And according to their result, it's about 7% of respondents who will over-report their willingness to fight. But even if that's true, then there will be more than 50 or even 60% of people in Taiwan saying that they are going to fight for the country. Yeah. So,
sorry, Xin, please.
Yeah, I would like to add one point. There are limits to survey method in evaluating people's willingness to fight in Taiwan in a way that underage people are almost always ruled out in all surveys. But when we judge the case in Hong Kong, most of the protesters and on the street are underage people. So if we're talking about the social society overall, so the participation of the overall society, then these people will be naturally like ruled out by surveys. So we cannot really get an exact. There are limits to our evaluation by survey.
Thank you. That's an important point. And also, I think when these types of questions have been asked to other groups outside of Taiwan, it's hard to know exactly what the actual participation would be in any sort of struggle before the fact. It often takes the fact itself to really galvanize a population. But I take your point, and that's an important one, Xin, about some of the limitations here. Can I ask, do we have a sense of how U.S. credibility and the perception that the United States would eventually intervene in a potential conflict affects the will to fight? In other words, if there's the perception that the United States has a credible commitment to defend Taiwan in the case of an attack, does that galvanize the will to fight, because there's an understanding that if Taiwan can last, a week or so, that the United States will eventually come, and vice versa, if the view is that the United States will not intervene, does that put downward pressure on the willingness to fight? Wen-Chin or Xin-Chin, do we have any sense of that?
We would expect that if U.S. skepticism should take an upper hand in time of crisis, that meaning China's attack on Taiwan, then that would arouse a strong call for surrender for Taiwan, which will cause great consequences in the East Asia security. So my take is that we should try to manage the U.S. skepticism brewing in Taiwan.
So I think on the other hand, we also have studies conducted by Oster Wang and UNLV. He has a paper showing that for Taiwanese people, if they know that the United States will help to defend Taiwan, then they will be more willing to defend Taiwan. So it's a collective action problem. So when Taiwanese people know that there are some people or some countries going to help us, then the willingness to self-defense will also increase. So that's a collective action issue. So it's not only for U.S. defense, but also other fellow citizens. So if Taiwanese citizens perceive that there are more fellow citizens going to fight collectively, they will be more willing to fight. So that's also supported by other study by political scientists. Yeah.
I will say, just this strikes me as a problematic dynamic where I think in the United States, the greater the overt demonstrations of the willingness to fight, the stronger the urge would be here in the United States to do more directly to increase our credibility. But vice versa, the willingness to fight would improve, and the desire for overt demonstrations of that would improve if the United States credibility in intervening in a potential conflict strengthened. So there's an unfortunate dynamic at work of we sort of need the other party needs to take the first step. And so this just seems to me a problem that has to be addressed. We're almost out of time here, so I don't want to ask another round of questions. Let me just open up the floor for a few minutes. I don't know if anyone had any final, Jianhui, Wenqin, Xinxin, James, anyone have any final thoughts or comments before we close out?
I'm afraid that if Trump should get elected and he continues his somewhat untraditional diplomatic rhetorics to or like commercial logic to political situation contingency in East Asia, then I'm afraid this might fuel U.S. skepticism in Taiwan, and that will further that would export polarization in the U.S. politics to Taiwanese politics.
I appreciate that comment. I always, whenever this comes up, I always just remind people of how broad and deep support for Taiwan is across the United States, and certainly almost everyone I come into contact with sees Taiwan as a critical partner. So of course, what a president thinks or a potential president thinks about an issue absolutely matters. But I would just caution to friends who are watching individual statements, I wouldn't overreact to them, even as we take them seriously. There is a very, very deep wellspring of support for Taiwan, just because of the understanding of what a critical partner Taiwan is for the United States, both technologically, democratically, and also in security. For 75 years, the United States has been an imperfect but nonetheless a partner of Taiwan's, and I don't think that's just going to go away because of an election. But that's just my own personal comment, and realize it's easier for me to say that than it is for you to believe it. But it's 10 o'clock. This has been a really important, informative hour. I want to thank all of you for sharing your survey results with us. James, can you remind me again the URL that we took down the slide deck, or Wenqin, I forget the URL they should go to learn more about this?
It may not be as helpful if I just kind of recite the URL, but if they Google American Portrait Taiwan, it should be probably the first result.
Okay. And if anyone forgets, it was earlier in the program we had the URL up, but just recommend that there's a lot of great, deeper work that you all are doing that is really important. And again, this is an underappreciated but really vital element, which is public opinion on Taiwan. And you've done a lot to really help shade in and give clarity on what are actions or statements that are helpful, unhelpful, how the United States can bolster its credibility. And ultimately, this is about making sure that we keep the Taiwan Strait prosperous and peaceful, and credible statements from the United States are not destabilizing. I think it's quite the opposite. This can fundamentally help clarify where the United States stands on this, and that will help, I think, in the long term bolster peace and stability. So this is a really important body of work that you are all doing, and want to thank you, and also want to thank everyone for tuning in. I really appreciate it. Appreciate the really great questions that have come in. I'm sorry that we were not able to get to all of them, but they were really fantastic and just speak to the level of curiosity and interest in such an important topic. So thanks to you for watching and sending your great questions. I hope everyone has a really great rest of your week, and see you on the next CSIS program. Thank you.